3:14 in the morning, Claire Donnelly woke up to a hand on her shoulder and the smell of cinnamon gum. She hadn't meant to fall asleep in the vinyl chair beside her father's hospital bed. She had meant to stay alert, to count his breaths, to be the kind of daughter who didn't need reminding to eat or drink water or exist outside of fear. Instead, her neck had a crick in it. Her phone had died somewhere around midnight, and a woman in lavender scrubs was crouched at her eye level, looking at her like she was a puzzle worth solving gently. "You haven't eaten," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Claire blinked at her. The badge clipped to her scrubs read, Sam Reyes, RN, Neuro. Claire would learn, in the weeks that followed, that Sam Reyes never raised her voice, never rushed a sentence, and never once made Claire feel like a burden, even when Claire was almost certain she was being one. "I'm fine," Claire said, which was the kind of thing people said at hospitals at 3 a.m., whether or not it was true. Sam didn't argue. She just held out a granola bar from her own pocket, the cheap kind, the kind nurses kept for exactly this reason, and said, "Eat this, or I'm telling the day shift you're a flight risk." It wasn't supposed to be funny. Claire's father had suffered a stroke 4 days earlier. Her sister was asleep in a waiting room 2 floors down. Her business, $3,000 in unbaked wedding cakes, was 400 miles away in Chicago, completely unattended. Nothing about this moment should have made Claire Donnelly laugh, but she did. Quietly, and only once, and Sam Reyes smiled like she'd won something. Neither of them knew yet that this was the beginning of anything. It would take 11 more chapters, a sister's suspicion, a hospital's rule book, and a question asked in a parking garage before either of them said it out loud. But it started here, with a granola bar, and a woman who noticed what other people missed. This is that story. By the time the sun came up over Nashville, Claire had eaten the granola bar, brushed her teeth with a travel kit from the gift shop, and convinced herself that Sam Reyes was simply good at her job. Nurses were trained to notice things. That was the whole point of them. It didn't mean anything that Claire kept glancing at the door every time it opened, hoping for lavender scrubs instead of the white coat of the attending physician. Her father, Walter Donnelly, was stable, but not yet talking in full sentences, the stroke having taken the left side of his face and most of his patience, leaving behind a man who scowled at his orange juice like it had personally wronged him. Claire found this oddly comforting. He'd always scowled at orange juice. Some things, apparently, survived. Her older sister Denise arrived at 7 with 2 coffees and the specific exhaustion of someone who had flown in from Atlanta on 4 hours' notice. Denise was the practical one, the one who'd become a project manager because she liked systems and distrusted feelings that didn't show up on a spreadsheet. She handed Claire a coffee, looked her up and down, and said, "You smell like a hospital gift shop." "I am a hospital gift shop," Claire said. "I'm basically a candle now." Denise didn't laugh, but her mouth did something close to it, which was usually as good as it got with Denise. And Claire had learned a long time ago not to ask for more. They settled into the rhythm that would define the next several weeks. Shift changes, doctor updates delivered in clipped medical shorthand, the particular boredom of waiting rooms that smelled like hand sanitizer and old coffee. Claire's phone buzzed constantly with messages from Priya, her shop manager back in Chicago, each one slightly more panicked than the last, because 2 wedding cakes were due in 9 days. Claire answered what she could between updates on their father's blood pressure, designing tear heights over text message while a man in the next bed argued with his cardiologist about golf. It was Sam who suggested, on the second day, that Claire and Denise take turns going home, or at least to the hotel 3 blocks away, instead of both haunting the waiting room like guilty ghosts. "He's not going anywhere tonight," Sam said, checking Walter's chart with the calm authority of someone who had said this exact sentence to 100 frightened families. "And neither of you will be useful to him if you collapse." "Is that a medical diagnosis?" Claire asked. "It's a Tuesday," Sam said. "I diagnose a lot of things on Tuesdays." Denise watched this exchange with the narrowed eyes of a woman doing complicated math. She didn't say anything yet. She wouldn't, not for another week. But Claire noticed the look, filed it away, and told herself it didn't mean anything, the same way she'd told herself the granola bar didn't mean anything. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. She had started organizing her whole day around whether or not Sam's shift overlapped with visiting hours, and she hadn't told a single person, including herself, why that mattered. That night, in the hotel room, Claire lay awake longer than she should have, replaying small things. The way Sam said her father's name correctly on the first try, when most people stumbled over the silent W sound their grandmother had insisted on generations ago. The way she paused at the door before leaving the room each time, just half a second, like she was making sure everyone in it was actually okay before she let herself walk away. Claire told herself this was just what good nurses did. She had, in fact, exactly one granola bar and a correctly pronounced name to go on, which was an embarrassingly small amount of evidence for the amount of thinking she was doing about it. By the end of the first week, the routine had a shape. Mornings belonged to Denise, who liked structure and didn't mind the early doctor rounds. Afternoons and evenings belonged to Claire, who found she could work on cake designs from a hospital chair just as easily as from her studio, sketching tiered structures on the backs of discharge pamphlets while her father slept. Sam started finding reasons to be in the room a little longer than her rounds technically required, straightening a blanket that didn't need straightening, asking Claire about the cakes and actually listening to the answers. She remembered details, too. Things nobody else had bothered to ask about in days. The bride who wanted sugared lavender on every tier. The groom who was allergic to almonds and terrified of telling his mother. It was, Claire would later admit to no one but herself, the first time all week she'd felt like a whole person instead of just a daughter in crisis mode. And that feeling was dangerous in a way she didn't yet have a name for. If you've ever sat in a hospital room and found yourself paying too much attention to one specific person walking in and out of it, drop a comment below and tell this story which moment you'd have noticed first. And if this kind of slow burn romance is your thing, hit subscribe. Because Claire and Sam's story is just getting started. Neither of them said anything that could be repeated later as evidence of intent. It was all granola bars and correctly pronounced names and half seconds at the door, small enough that either of them could have denied it under oath. But Claire was a bolera. She understood, better than most people, how something could be built slowly, in careful layers, long before anyone called it finished, and how the structures that lasted were rarely the ones assembled in a hurry. Walter Donnelly had never been a man of many words, even before the stroke made the words themselves harder to find. And Claire had spent her whole life learning to read him in other ways. The angle of his eyebrows, the speed of his fork against a plate, the specific silence he used when he was proud of something, but unwilling to say so. On the 10th day, when he managed to say her name clearly for the first time since the hospital, she cried in the hallway where he couldn't see her, because some relief was too large to perform in front of the person who caused it. Sam found her there, back against the wall, mascara doing something unfortunate under her eyes. She didn't reach for her, didn't say anything soothing or rehearsed. She just sat down on the floor next to Claire, in full view of anyone who might walk by, and stayed quiet until Claire's breathing evened out on its own. "He said my name," Claire finally managed. "I know," Sam said. "I heard him. It was a good one. Very clear consonants." It was such a strange, specific thing to say that Claire laughed despite herself, the sound coming out wet and unattractive, and Sam looked pleased rather than embarrassed for her, which Claire would later decide was the moment she stopped being able to pretend this was just professional kindness. Nurses did not sit on hospital floors. Nurses had rounds, charts, a dozen other patients whose families also needed something. Sam had chosen, in that particular half hour, to give her time to someone who had nothing to offer back. Denise noticed the mascara when Claire returned to the room, and noticed, too, the slightly too careful way Claire avoided mentioning where she'd been crying, or who had been with her. Denise didn't say anything that first time. She filed it away the way Claire had been filing away small things about Sam for 2 weeks now. 2 sisters quietly building separate cases about the same set of facts. That evening, while Walter slept and Denise went to find better coffee than the hospital's, Claire sat at her father's bedside and finally let herself think clearly about what was happening. She was 31 years old. She had not, technically, had a real conversation with Sam Reyes that lasted longer than 10 minutes. She knew her shift pattern, her taste in granola bars, the way she said her father's name, and almost nothing else. Not where she'd grown up, not whether she had family of her own, not even her middle name. And yet Claire found herself rearranging her whole day around the small windows when Sam's rounds intersected with visiting hours, the way she used to rearrange her bakery's whole production schedule around a particularly difficult wedding order, with the same mixture of dread and anticipation. She told herself this was simply what happened to people under stress, that hospitals manufactured intimacy the way certain ovens manufactured heat, fast and artificial, and impossible to trust. But then Sam would walk in, check Walter's vitals with unhurried hands, and ask Claire something specific. Not, "How are you holding up?" the question everyone else asked, but something like, "Did the lavender bride ever pick a font for the cake topper?" And the manufactured intimacy theory would collapse under the weight of how much Sam actually seemed to remember and want to know more. On the 12th day, Walter was moved out of the ICU and into a standard recovery room, a small victory that Denise celebrated by booking flights home for the following week, assuming, reasonably, that the worst was behind them and ordinary life could resume its shape. Claire found herself oddly unsettled by the plane tickets, a feeling she didn't examine closely enough to name, though if she had, she might have noticed it looked exactly like dread. She told herself the bakery needed her. Priya's texts had grown from panicked to faintly desperate, 2 cakes delivered late, and a 3rd client threatening to leave a review with the word unprofessional in the title. Chicago was where her life was, her business, her apartment, the version of herself that made sense to other people. Nashville was a hospital room, and a man named Walter who scowled at orange juice, and a nurse who remembered the names of strangers' wedding cakes. That night, lying in the hotel room while Denise packed in the next bed, Claire found herself doing math she had no business doing yet, counting the days until discharge, the days until her flight, the days, if she was being honest with herself, until she might run out of reasons to see Sam Reyes at all. It was an absurd thing to grieve in advance, a relationship that had never been named, built entirely out of granola bars and half-seconds at the door. But Claire had learned, in 11 years of building wedding cakes for strangers, that some structures held weight long before anyone admitted what they were actually holding up. Denise's suspicion finally found words on a Thursday afternoon in the hospital parking garage. While Claire fumbled with the validation ticket, and Denise stood with her arms crossed in the particular stance she'd used since childhood to announce she had something uncomfortable to say. "You like her," Denise said. No preamble, no softening. The nurse, Sam. Claire's hands stilled on the parking machine. "She's been good to Dad," Claire said carefully. "She's good to her job," Denise said. "That's different from whatever look is on your face right now." Claire wanted to argue, and found she couldn't, not convincingly, not to a sister who had watched her fall apart and reassemble herself through 2 prior relationships, and knew exactly what the early stages looked like on her. "It doesn't matter," Claire finally said. "I'm leaving in a week. She works here. It's not a real thing, Denise. It's a hospital thing. It happens to everyone. You get attached to the person who's kind to you when your whole life is on fire." Denise's expression didn't soften the way Claire had hoped. "That's exactly what worries me," she said. "You're not falling for Sam. You're falling for the first person who made you feel okay during the worst 2 weeks of your life, and those aren't always the same thing." It was, Claire thought, an unfairly precise thing for her sister to say, the kind of observation that lodged itself somewhere and refused to leave even after the conversation ended. They didn't speak again until they reached Walter's floor, where Sam was adjusting his pillows with the same unhurried care she brought to everything, and Claire watched Denise watch the two of them interact. The easy way Sam asked Walter about his physical therapy goals, the way she caught Claire's eye afterward just to check, silently, that Claire was doing okay too. Denise said nothing in front of Sam. She didn't need to. Her face said it clearly enough, and Claire spent the rest of the visit acutely aware of every small thing Sam did, cataloging it now with a kind of guilty attention, as though her sister's suspicion had turned ordinary kindness into evidence that needed sorting. It didn't help that Walter, slurred but unmistakable, asked Sam at one point whether she had a husband waiting at home, the kind of question fathers ask nurses out of habit rather than malice, and Sam answered easily, "No husband, Mr. Donnelly. Just me and a very opinionated cat," without so much as a glance in Claire's direction. Though Claire felt the answer land somewhere specific anyway, a small fact filed carefully alongside the granola bars and the correctly pronounced name. That night, after Denise had gone to sleep, Claire found herself outside the hospital's small courtyard garden, the one reserved technically for patients but rarely enforced after dark, turning her sister's words over like a stone in her pocket. Was it real, or was it relief wearing a more interesting face? Claire had been the kind of person, in her 20s, who mistook urgency for connection more than once, who'd built 2 relationships on the adrenaline of crisis and watched them collapse the moment ordinary life resumed. She was still sitting there when Sam found her, off shift now, wearing a denim jacket over her scrubs and carrying 2 paper cups of something that smelled like vending machine cocoa. "You looked like you needed a worse coffee than what's upstairs," Sam said, handing one over without being asked, and sat down on the bench beside her, close enough that Claire could feel the warmth coming off her arm in the cool evening air. "My sister thinks I'm projecting," Claire said, because apparently the cocoa had loosened something in her. Or maybe it was just easier to be honest in the dark, that I like the relief you give me more than I actually like you. Sam was quiet for a long moment, turning her own cup in her hands. "Is she wrong?" she finally asked, and there was something careful in the question, like she genuinely wanted to know the answer, rather than be reassured. "I don't know," Claire admitted. "I think about you when you're not here. That's either a very good sign or a very bad one, and I can't tell which from inside it." Sam laughed softly at that, but it wasn't dismissive. It sounded like recognition. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think about you too, and I've had a lot more practice telling the difference between gratitude and something else. This isn't gratitude. I just don't know what to do with it, given everything." Given everything hung between them, heavier than either of them addressed directly. But Claire understood even then that it meant the badge clipped to Sam's jacket, the rules that came with it, the version of this story that could end Sam's career if it started in the wrong place at the wrong time. They sat together until the cocoa went cold, not touching, not naming anything further. 2 women carefully not finishing a sentence, neither of them was ready to start. When Sam finally stood to leave, she paused, the way she always did at the doorway of Walter's room. That same half-second of checking, except this time there was no door and no patient between them, just a courtyard bench and a question neither of them had asked yet, sitting in the space where the next sentence should have gone. Sam's cat, it turned out, was named Disaster, a fact Claire learned 3 days later, when Sam showed her a photo on a break between rounds. A fat orange tabby sprawled across an unmade bed like he owned the building and resented having to share it with anyone, including Sam. "He knocked a glass of wine off my nightstand the night I adopted him," Sam explained. "Named him on the spot. Felt accurate." Claire laughed harder than the story strictly deserved, but she was starting to learn that this was simply what happened around Sam. Ordinary things became funnier. Heavier things became lighter, and time moved differently when she was in the room. It was the first real piece of Sam's life outside the hospital that Claire had been given, and she found herself hungry for more of it. the way she used to be hungry for the smell of a cake coming together in layers before it became something whole. Where had Sam grown up? Why Nashville? What did she do with the parts of herself that weren't on a hospital floor? Claire didn't ask all at once. She'd learned in the bakery business that you didn't rush a structure that needed to set. Instead, she asked one question at a time, across the gaps between Sam's rounds, the way someone might add a single layer of frosting and wait for it to hold before adding the next. Sam had grown up in 3 different foster homes before she turned 18, the last one decent enough that she'd kept the family's last name out of something close to gratitude, though she rarely spoke to them now. She'd chosen nursing, she said, because she'd spent so much of her childhood being the kid nobody fully took care of that she'd wanted. Eventually, to be the person who did the taking care of. That's a lot to carry into a job where you watch people almost die, Claire said carefully, and Sam shrugged in a way that didn't quite hide how true the observation was. Most days it's fine. Some days it's a lot. This is one of the good days, she added, glancing at Claire in a way that made the sentence mean more than its surface. And Claire felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with recognition. She told Sam, in return, about the early years of the bakery, the studio apartment doubling as a kitchen, the wedding she'd nearly ruined by forgetting a groom's nut allergy until the morning of delivery, the slow, terrifying climb from a single rented oven to a shop with her name on the window. She told her about their mother, too, gone 8 years now, and how Walter had never quite learned to be a single parent, how Denise had stepped into the gap their mother left and never fully stepped back out of it, how Claire had spent her 20s trying to be easy enough that nobody had to worry about her, too. Sam listened the way she did everything else, unhurried, attentive, asking exactly the right small question at exactly the right moment to keep Claire talking, instead of retreating into the polished version of her own story she usually told strangers. Nobody had asked Claire about her mother in years without the conversation curdling into pity or discomfort. Sam asked about her the way she asked about wedding cakes, like the answer genuinely mattered. Like Claire's grief was simply another part of her worth knowing, rather than something to be managed around. It was during one of these conversations, somewhere around the 2nd week, that Walter, half asleep, more lucid than either of them realized, said, without opening his eyes, "You two talk like people who've known each other longer than 2 weeks." Neither of them answered him. Sam's ears went faintly pink. Claire studied her father's IV line with sudden, intense interest. Walter, satisfied with the silence, which told him everything the words hadn't, went back to sleep with the specific smugness of a man who still knew exactly what he was doing, stroke or no stroke. Denise, when Claire relayed the moment later, didn't look surprised so much as resigned, the expression of someone watching a prediction confirm itself in real time. "I'm not trying to ruin this for you," she said carefully, choosing her words the way she chose everything, with engineering precision. "I just don't want you building something real on a foundation that's going to disappear the second Dad gets discharged and we all fly home. I've watched you do that before. I don't want to watch it again." Claire didn't have an answer for that, not yet. Not one she trusted enough to say out loud. She only knew that somewhere in the last 2 weeks, between granola bars and a cat named Disaster, and a half-asleep blessing from their father, this had stopped feeling like something built on crisis, and started feeling like something built slowly, on purpose. Though purpose, she was learning, did not automatically come with a plan for what happened next. The trouble announced itself in the form of a man named Greg Ashworth, the floor's unit manager, who stopped Sam in the hallway on a Tuesday morning with the particular tightness of someone who'd rehearsed what he was about to say. Claire wasn't meant to overhear it, standing as she was just inside Walter's doorway. But hospital hallways carried sound in ways nobody designed on purpose. And she caught enough. Personal involvement, family member of a patient, Policy 4.2, subsection B, to feel her stomach drop somewhere near her shoes. Sam's voice, when she answered, was steady in a way that cost her something visible. "I haven't done anything that violates policy, Greg." "Not yet," he said, not unkindly. which somehow made it worse. But people are noticing how much time you're spending in that room, and I'd rather have this conversation now than after a complaint, for your sake. He left before Sam could respond further, and when she stepped into Walter's room a moment later, her professional composure had a visible crack in it for the first time since Claire had met her. "How much trouble?" Claire asked quietly, once Walter had drifted back to sleep. "Are you actually in?" Sam exhaled slowly, sitting down in the chair across from Claire's instead of standing the way she usually did during visits. "Not official trouble, not yet. But the hospital has rules about nurse-family relationships for a reason, Claire. It's not just bureaucracy. It's about patients not feeling like their care is compromised, about protecting people who are vulnerable. I believe in that rule, mostly. I just didn't expect to be the one it applied to." "Mostly," Claire repeated. Sam looked up at her, and for the first time since the granola bar, there was something unguarded in her face, something that looked almost like fear. "I told you about a foster home I aged out of and a cat I named after a wine stain," Sam said. "I don't talk like that, ever. I have exactly 2 people in this city I'd call if something went wrong at 3 in the morning, and I just met one of them 2.5 weeks ago in a vinyl chair." Claire understood, with sudden clarity, that this was as close to a confession as Sam was going to allow herself while still in uniform, in a hospital, with a man named Greg watching from somewhere down the hall. "So what do we do?" Claire asked, "if we both already know what this is?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, turning a pen over in her hands the way she did when she was working through something methodically, the same way she checked vitals, careful and unhurried even under pressure. "We wait," she finally said, "until Walter's discharged, until I'm not technically his nurse anymore and there's nothing for Greg or anyone else to flag. It's not romantic. I know it's not what either of us wants to hear right now. But I've seen what happens to nurses who get this wrong, even with good intentions, and I'm not willing to lose the only job I've ever been good at over something that could just as easily wait 3 weeks." It was a reasonable request from a reasonable person, and Claire hated, with a small, unworthy heat in her chest, how reasonable it was. She'd spent her whole adult life being patient with cakes that needed exactly the right rise time, patient with a father who took 3 days to say her name clearly, patient with a sister who needed time to trust things she couldn't fully explain. She wasn't sure she had patience left over for this too, for waiting on a feeling that was already fully formed and simply wasn't allowed to be spoken yet. "Okay," Claire said anyway, because the alternative was asking Sam to risk something Claire had no right to ask her to risk. "We wait, but I want it on record that I think Policy 42, subsection B, is deeply inconvenient." That got the smallest laugh out of Sam, the crack in her composure closing back up into something steadier, though her eyes stayed on Claire a beat longer than the joke required, like she was memorizing something she'd have to live on for a while. What neither of them said in that conversation was the part that worried Claire most when she lay awake later that night. Waiting until discharge assumed there would still be a reason for either of them to keep showing up afterward, once the hospital floor that had thrown them together stopped existing as a shared space. Sam had Nashville, a job she loved, a life built carefully over years. Claire had a bakery 400 miles away, and a return flight that existed, increasingly, like a deadline neither of them wanted to mention out loud. Denise, predictably, had opinions about the overheard hallway conversation when Claire told her. Fewer than expected, though, and gentler. "I still think you're moving fast," she said. "But I'll admit, for what it's worth, that a nurse who's willing to risk her job to do this the right way, instead of the easy way, isn't exactly the red flag I was bracing for." It wasn't approval. Not quite. But from Denise, it was close enough to count as one. The lavender bride's cake was due in 4 days, and Claire found herself, for the first time since arriving in Nashville, genuinely torn between 2 places at once. Not in the abstract way she'd been torn before, but in the very specific, very practical way of a woman who owed a stranger 4 tiers of sugared flowers and a structurally sound buttercream foundation. Priya's texts had stopped being panicked and started being something closer to mutinous, and Claire understood, reading them in the hospital cafeteria over bad coffee, that she couldn't keep running a business by remote control forever. "Go," Denise said, when Claire finally raised it, surprising her with how little resistance the suggestion met. "Dad's stable. I've got the next few days. You built an entire business. You can't let it fall apart because you're scared of what happens if you leave this room for 48 hours. It was, Claire thought, a more perceptive comment than her sister probably realized, since the fear wasn't really about the bakery at all. Though Denise likely knew that too, and was choosing not to say it directly. Sam, when Claire told her, didn't try to talk her out of it, though something in her expression flickered before she covered it with the same steady calm she brought to everything. 48 hours, Sam repeated. You'll be back Thursday? Thursday night, Claire confirmed. I deliver the cake, I yell at Priya affectionately. I sleep in my own bed for one night, and I'm on a flight back here before the lavender even wilts. Sam nodded slowly, like she was filing the information away the careful way she filed away everything else. The trip to Chicago was a strange kind of whiplash. Her own apartment, smelling faintly of vanilla and disuse. Her own studio, the familiar weight of a piping bag in her hand after weeks of holding nothing heavier than a hospital cafeteria fork. She built the cake in 11 focused hours, sugared lavender sprigs drying in careful rows, and delivered it herself, instead of sending Priya, partly out of guilt, and partly because the bride cried when she saw it, and Claire had forgotten, in the fog of the last 3 weeks, how good that particular kind of crying felt to cause. It was somewhere around hour 30 of the 48 that Claire admitted to herself what the trip had actually proven. Which was not that she could still run her business. She'd never doubted that. But that Chicago no longer felt like the center of gravity it used to be. Her apartment felt like a place she used to live. Her phone, charging on the counter, felt heavier for being 400 miles from the one person she actually wanted to text. She caught herself, twice, reaching for her phone to tell Sam something funny that had happened, before remembering Sam wasn't there to tell.
If you're getting invested in this story, there's so much more waiting for you on my Patreon. You'll find exclusive romances, extended chapters, bonus scenes, and moments that make every relationship even more intense. Take a look at everything right below.
Priya, watching Claire pack her overnight bag again for the return flight after barely 24 hours back, finally said what Denise had been too diplomatic to say outright. You're not coming back to Chicago full-time, are you? Not really. Claire opened her mouth to argue, and found, to her own surprise, that she couldn't. I don't know, she said honestly, which was at least more honest than she'd been with herself in days. I know I want to be on a plane back to Nashville in 6 hours. That's the only thing I'm sure of right now. The flight back felt shorter than the flight out, the particular kind of shorter that happens when a person is moving towards something instead of away from it, and Claire spent most of it staring out the window, composing and deleting the text she wanted to send Sam, unsure how to say, I missed you in a way that scared me, to someone she technically wasn't allowed to date yet. In the end, she sent something simpler, landing at the gate before she lost her nerve. Lavender Bride cried, worth it. Landing in 20. Tell disaster I said hello. Sam's reply came before Claire had even reached baggage claim. 3 words that did more to settle the unsettled thing in Claire's chest than anything had in weeks. He says hi back. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't the conversation either of them was still officially withholding from each other under Policy 4. 2. Subsection B. But it was, Claire thought, exactly the kind of small true thing this entire relationship had been built out of from the very first granola bar, and she found she didn't mind anymore how slowly it was being built. Walter's second scare came without warning, the way the first one had. Except this time, Claire was in the room when it happened. A sudden slurring mid-sentence, his coffee cup tilting in a hand that had stopped fully cooperating with his brain. and the particular controlled chaos of a code being called that Claire would remember in fragments for years afterward. She remembered Sam's voice cutting clean through the noise, giving instructions to other nurses with none of the softness she used with Claire, all precision and speed. She remembered being moved bodily into the hallway by someone whose name she never learned. It was a transient ischemic attack, the doctor explained later. Not a second stroke exactly, but close enough to one that it changed the recovery timeline considerably. Close enough that Claire spent the following hour sitting on the hallway floor with her back against the wall, unable to fully process the words being said to her. Denise arrived 15 minutes later, having raced from the hotel, and found Claire exactly where Sam had found her weeks earlier, except this time there was no one available to sit down beside her. Sam was still inside, working, doing the job that meant she couldn't be the person Claire needed her to be in that particular moment. It took 4 hours before Walter was stable again. 4 hours that aged Claire in ways she suspected wouldn't fully show until much later. And when Sam finally emerged from the room, off the clock now, exhausted in a way Claire hadn't seen on her before, she didn't say anything performative or reassuring. She simply sat down on the floor again, in the same spot, and let Claire put her head on her shoulder without comment, the rule about professional distance apparently suspended by mutual unspoken agreement for exactly as long as the crisis required, and not 1 second longer. "I'm sorry," Sam said eventually, very quietly. "I couldn't come find you while it was happening. I had a job to do." "I know," Claire said, and meant it, though some small unworthy part of her had wanted. In the worst hour, for Sam to choose her instead of the job, even knowing how unfair and impossible that want actually was. She didn't say that part out loud. She didn't think she needed to. Sam's face, when she finally looked at her, suggested she already understood exactly what Claire hadn't said. Denise, watching the two of them from a respectful distance, finally approached after a long while and said something that surprised both of them. "Thank you," she said to Sam simply, "for getting him through that, and for being here for her after, even though you clearly should be asleep right now." It wasn't approval exactly, the way Claire had hoped for weeks to hear from her sister, but it was something close enough to recognition that Claire felt her throat tighten all over again, for entirely different reasons than before. The recovery this time was slower and more cautious, the doctors more guarded with their projections, and Claire understood, somewhere in the careful new language being used around her father's prognosis, that the version of this story, where everyone simply flew home in a tidy 2 weeks, had quietly stopped being available to anyone. Walter would need longer rehabilitation. The discharge date, once a fixed point on a calendar Claire had been both dreading and counting down to, dissolved into something vaguer and harder to plan around. Priya's texts, when Claire finally found the energy to check her phone, had shifted tone entirely, no longer panicked about cakes, but gentle in a way that surprised her. "Take the time you need," she'd written. "I can run the shop another month if I have to. Your dad matters more than a wedding cake, even a really good one." Claire cried reading it, a different kind of crying than the hallway tears from weeks earlier. Something closer to gratitude for the people who made room for her to be somewhere other than where they needed her. That night, once Walter was stable and sleeping, and Denise had finally gone to rest, Sam found Claire in the courtyard garden again, 2 cups of the same bad vending machine cocoa between them, and admitted something she hadn't said before. "I almost didn't go into his room when the code was called," she said carefully. "For half a second. Because I was scared of what I'd feel if it went badly, and how hard it would be to keep doing my job around that feeling. That scared me more than the actual code did." It was, Claire understood, Sam's version of the same fear Claire had been carrying. That this thing growing between them, careful and unofficial as it still was, had already become large enough to complicate the things that mattered most to both of them. Neither of them apologized for it. Neither of them pretended it wasn't true. They simply sat with it, together, in the dark. 2 women who had each, in their own way, just discovered exactly how much weight this fragile, unfinished thing between them was already capable of carrying. Walter, 3 days later, lucid enough to notice the shift in the room's energy, looked between his daughter and her nurse with the same knowing expression he'd worn weeks earlier, and said with the bluntness only a man recovering from a brain event could get away with, "Whatever this is, stop waiting for my permission. I gave it the day she sat on the floor with you the first time." Neither Claire nor Sam had a response prepared for that. And for once, the silence between them felt less like restraint, and more like the beginning of something neither of them could keep postponing. Walter's blessing, however blunt, didn't erase Policy 4.2, subsection B, and Sam was careful, in the days that followed, to keep the boundaries of the hospital exactly where they needed to be. Professional in front of colleagues, professional on the floor, professional in every charted interaction with a precision that occasionally made Claire ache with how unfair the whole arrangement felt. But off the clock, in the courtyard garden, or the hospital parking structure, or, increasingly, in the 30 minutes Sam had free between a double shift, something had shifted permanently, and neither of them tried to deny it anymore. It was Sam who finally suggested an actual date, the kind with a beginning and an end and a destination that wasn't a hospital bench, 3 days after Walter's near relapse stabilized into something the doctors were cautiously optimistic about again. "I have a night off Friday," she said, in the same careful tone she used for difficult medical updates, which made Claire laugh before she understood why Sam was being so formal about it. "I'd like to take you somewhere that isn't a parking garage, if that's something you'd want." Friday arrived with the specific nervousness of two people who had already shared more vulnerability than most couples managed in months, yet had never once gone anywhere together that wasn't dictated by crisis. Sam picked a small restaurant near the river, the kind with mismatched chairs and a menu that changed weekly, and showed up not in scrubs, but in a green dress that made Claire briefly forget how to form a complete sentence, which Sam seemed to notice and enjoy more than was strictly fair. "You look like you're trying to remember English," Sam said, sliding into the booth across from her, and Claire admitted, "I think I forgot it somewhere around the parking lot," which earned her the kind of unguarded laugh Sam rarely allowed herself. Even in the courtyard at midnight, over dinner they talked about things that had nothing to do with hospitals or strokes or discharge timelines. Sam's terrible taste in reality television, Claire's complicated relationship with her own mother's old cookbook, the particular indignity of Disaster's refusal to use any litter box that wasn't, in his opinion, freshly cleaned. It was, Claire realized somewhere around dessert, the first time in nearly a month that she'd had an entire conversation that wasn't shaped, even slightly, by fear. No monitors beeping in the background, no half-listened ear toward a hallway. Just two people learning each other in the ordinary, unhurried way most relationships were supposed to start, and theirs simply hadn't been allowed to yet. Sam reached across the table at one point, not dramatically, just to brush a strand of hair from Claire's face, and the gesture landed with more weight than anything either of them had said all night. "I keep waiting for this to feel complicated," Claire admitted, watching candlelight do something flattering to the angles of Sam's face. "It doesn't. It just feels like dinner." "Don't jinx it," Sam said, though she was smiling. "We still have Policy 4.2 to deal with the second we're both back in that building." "Tonight, we're not in that building," Claire pointed out, and Sam, after a moment's consideration, seemed to find that argument entirely persuasive. They walked along the river afterward, the Nashville skyline doing something gold and unserious in the last of the evening light. And somewhere along that walk, without either of them announcing it as a milestone, their hands found each other and simply stayed that way. No grand declaration, no rehearsed line, just two palms fitting together the way two people occasionally just fit, easily. Like the most obvious thing in the world had finally been allowed to happen in daylight instead of hospital shadows. Sam walked her back to the hotel afterward, and at the door, the kiss that finally happened wasn't urgent or dramatic, the kind built for spectacle. It was slow and careful, and almost unbearably tender. The kind of kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like a quiet confirmation of something that had already been true for weeks. Sam pulled back first, resting her forehead lightly against Claire's for a moment, both of them breathing a little unevenly, and said simply, "I've wanted to do that since the granola bar." "That took you 3 weeks," Claire murmured. "I'm very professional," Sam said. It was a struggle. When Claire finally went inside, alone, she found herself standing in the hotel hallway for a long moment before she could make herself move. The particular kind of stillness that comes after something has shifted permanently and the body hasn't quite caught up to the news yet. She thought of her sister's warning in the parking garage weeks ago about building things on foundations that wouldn't hold, and understood, with a clarity she hadn't possessed then, that this wasn't relief wearing Sam's face after all. It had simply taken 3 weeks of careful, deliberate, unhurried building to become unmistakably, undeniably itself. The trouble, when it came again, arrived from an unexpected direction. The almond-allergic groom from weeks earlier, whose wedding cake Claire had built before any of this began, posted an enthusiastic, well-meaning, completely public review online that mentioned in passing the adorable story behind our cake. Turns out our baker fell for her dad's nurse during his hospital stay. True love finding you in the worst circumstances. It was sweet. It was sincere. It was also seen, within 48 hours, by Greg Ashworth, who forwarded it to hospital administration with a note that used the phrase "potential policy violation" twice in 3 sentences. Sam was called into a formal meeting the following Monday, the kind with a closed door and a human resources representative present, and Claire spent the entire hour pacing the hospital cafeteria, unable to eat, unable to sit still, certain on some irrational level that she had personally cost Sam the only job she'd ever been good at, simply by existing publicly in a stranger's online review. When Sam finally emerged, her face was unreadable in a way Claire hadn't seen since the granola bar morning, careful and closed and giving nothing away. "They're not firing me," Sam said before Claire could ask, watching relief crash visibly across Claire's face. "But I am being reassigned, off Walter's care entirely, effective immediately, and there's a formal note in my file about appropriate boundaries that I'll be living with for a while." She said it evenly, professionally, the way she delivered difficult medical news, but Claire caught the small tremor underneath it. The cost of something Sam had spent her entire career building carefully, now permanently marked by a stranger's well-intentioned review. "This is my fault," Claire said immediately, the guilt arriving faster than she could organize it into anything useful. "If I hadn't told that groom anything, if I just kept this between us—" "You didn't tell him anything?" Sam interrupted gently. "Priya did, apparently, in some group chat that got screenshotted, and none of that is something either of us controlled. I'm not angry at you, Claire. I knew this was a risk from the moment I sat down next to you on that hallway floor. I made the choice anyway." It didn't fully ease the guilt, but it changed its shape, and Claire understood, watching Sam absorb a professional consequence she hadn't fully earned, exactly how much this relationship had already cost the person who had the most to lose in it. Denise, hearing the full story that evening, surprised Claire again by directing her irritation not at Sam or at the situation generally, but squarely at the almond groom. "People need to stop announcing other people's love lives on the internet," she said with real feeling, especially when one of those people has an HR file to worry about. The reassignment meant Sam no longer had any professional reason to be in Walter's room at all, and the absence of her, even for 2 days, left a hole in the hospital routine that Claire felt more sharply than she expected. No half-second pause at the door, no granola bars, no quiet correction of Walter's blood pressure cuff angle. She texted Sam instead, careful, ordinary texts about nothing, the kind 2 people send when they're trying to prove to each other that distance hasn't changed anything fundamental between them. Sam, when she finally had an evening free 3 days later, met Claire in the courtyard again, off the clock, and visibly more relaxed without the formal weight of the meeting hanging over her. "For what it's worth," she said, settling onto their usual bench, "the reassignment isn't all bad. I'm not your father's nurse anymore, which technically means policy 4. 2 doesn't apply to us at all now. We could theoretically do something as scandalous as eat lunch together in the cafeteria where people can see us. Claire laughed, surprised by how quickly the relief arrived once Sam framed it that way, the silver lining she hadn't thought to look for in her guilt. We could hold hands in an elevator, she offered. Reckless, Sam agreed solemnly. Someone might write a review about it. It was easier, after that, to laugh about the whole ordeal than to keep carrying it as guilt, though Claire privately resolved to thank the almond groom properly someday, once enough time had passed that the gesture wouldn't reopen anything still healing. What the reassignment had actually done, Claire realized over the following days, was strip away the last excuse either of them had been using to avoid the larger, harder conversation neither had fully had yet. The one about what happened after Walter's discharge, after Claire's return flight, after the hospital that had thrown them together in the first place, stopped being a shared reason to see each other daily. The policy obstacle was gone. What remained was simpler and somehow more frightening. 2 people who had to decide, on purpose, without a hospital forcing their hand, whether this was a relationship built to survive ordinary distance. Walter, informed of the reassignment in the careful, edited version Claire gave him, simply grunted and said, "Good. Now maybe she can take you somewhere besides this building," which was, by Walter Donnelly's standards, practically a toast at a wedding. Walter's discharge date finally arrived, 6 weeks after the stroke that started everything, accompanied by a folder of physical therapy instructions, a walker he resented on principle, and a prognosis that was cautiously, genuinely good. It should have felt like nothing but celebration, and for an hour or 2, it did. Denise crying happy tears in the hospital parking lot, Walter complaining about the walker with real vigor for the first time in weeks, the unmistakable relief of a crisis finally, officially closing. But underneath the celebration, Claire felt the other deadline arriving with it, the one she'd been quietly avoiding. There was no longer any medical reason for her to stay in Nashville. The conversation she'd been postponing finally happened that night, in Sam's apartment, the first time Claire had been there. A small, comfortable space with exactly the amount of orange cat hair on every surface that the photos had promised. Disaster regarded Claire with deep suspicion from the top of a bookshelf, and Sam laughed at his audacity while pouring 2 glasses of wine she barely touched. "So," Sam said eventually, setting her glass down with deliberate care, "your dad's discharged. What happens now?" It was the question Claire had been turning over for days without landing anywhere solid. "I have a business in Chicago," she said slowly. "A shop with my name on it. Employees who depend on me. 6 years of work I'm not ready to walk away from. But I also have..." She gestured vaguely at the apartment, at Sam, at the cat glaring down from the bookshelf. "This, whatever this is. And I don't know how to want both of those things without one of them losing." Sam was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet Claire was learning meant she was choosing her words with real care, rather than avoiding the question. "I'm not going to ask you to give up your shop," she finally said. "I watched you talk about that lavender bride's cake with more genuine joy than I've seen on most people talking about their own weddings. That's not something I want to be the reason you lose." "But," Claire said, hearing the word coming before Sam said it. "But I also don't think long-distance works the way people pretend it does in movies," Sam continued. "Not for 2 people who are still this new, who haven't even had a real fight yet, who've spent the entire relationship so far inside one building. I think distance either kills new things slowly, or it forces them to grow up faster than they're ready to. I don't know which one we'd be." It was, Claire thought, the most honest anyone had been with her about the actual mechanics of love in months, possibly years. "What if I split it?" Claire offered, the idea arriving half-formed even as she said it aloud. "Nashville and Chicago both, for a while. Priya's been running the shop well enough that I could trust her with more of it, train an assistant manager, fly back for the big events. It's not a perfect plan. It might not even be a sustainable one. but I don't want to choose between you and the bakery tonight, in your apartment, with your cat judging me from a bookshelf, when I haven't even given the harder option a real try." Sam's expression softened into something unguarded, the same look she'd worn the night of their first kiss. "That's a lot of flights," she said, but she was smiling now, the worry visibly loosening from her shoulders. "I've built 4-tier cakes on worse logistics," Claire said. "I think I can handle an airport." Sam laughed properly then, real and unrestrained, and crossed the small distance between them to kiss her, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that felt less like a question now and more like an answer both of them had already chosen. They didn't solve everything that night. There were still details to work out, costs to consider, the genuine uncertainty of whether a relationship could survive being built in 2 cities instead of 1. But for the first time since the granola bar, Claire didn't feel like she was waiting for permission from a policy, a sister, a discharge date, or her own fear of repeating old mistakes. She felt, instead, like she was simply choosing something, deliberately, with her eyes open, the way she chose every ingredient that went into a cake meant to last through an entire wedding day and beyond it. Denise, informed of the plan over breakfast the next morning, took it with more grace than Claire expected, though she couldn't resist one final piece of sisterly skepticism. "2 cities is ambitious," she said, buttering toast with surgical precision. "I give it 6 months before one of you caves and moves." "Is that a bet?" Claire asked. "It's an observation," Denise said, "but if you want to make it a bet, I'll take the over." It wasn't quite a blessing, but from Denise, the willingness to joke about it at all was its own kind of approval. Walter, overhearing from the next room, called out, without looking up from his crossword puzzle, "Just don't make me fly to Nashville for every holiday. I've had enough of this hospital's parking garage to last a lifetime," which everyone agreed, with real affection, was a fair enough condition to build a long-distance relationship around. The first real fight, when it finally arrived 3 months later, had nothing to do with grand betrayals or broken promises, and everything to do with a missed video call, a brutal week of back-to-back orders at the bakery, and the particular exhaustion of 2 people trying to maintain intimacy across 400 miles while their individual lives kept demanding more than either of them had left to give. Claire had forgotten, for the 3rd time that month, to call when she said she would, swallowed whole by a 16-hour day building 3 cakes simultaneously, and Sam, who had rearranged an entire shift to be free for that call, did not take the silence well. "It's not about the call," Sam said over the phone the next morning, her voice tighter than Claire had heard it in months. "It's that I keep being the one rearranging things, and you keep being the one who forgets. And I'm starting to wonder if this 2-city plan is actually working the way we said it would, or if I'm just the person waiting on the other end of a phone that doesn't ring." Claire, exhausted and defensive and genuinely guilty, responded worse than she meant to. "I have a business, Sam. I can't just drop a wedding cake because you rearranged a shift." "I'm not asking you to drop a cake," Sam said, her voice rising for the first time since Claire had known her. "I'm asking you to remember that I exist on the other end of this, not just as someone who's patient and understanding every single time, but as a person who also gets tired of being patient." The call ended badly, neither of them quite slamming anything down, but both of them retreating into a silence that lasted 2 full days, the longest either of them had gone without speaking since the granola bar morning. Claire spent those 2 days in a low simmer of guilt and stubbornness, replaying the conversation, building a case in her head for why she'd been right, then dismantling that case an hour later, when she remembered the genuine hurt in Sam's voice. She called Denise instead, half expecting an "I told you so," that, to her surprise, never came. "You're allowed to fight," Denise said simply. "Every real relationship has one of these eventually. The question isn't whether you fought. It's whether you're willing to actually fix it instead of just waiting for the silence to feel normal." It was, Claire admitted to herself, exactly the problem. She had spent the 2 days waiting for the discomfort to fade, rather than doing anything to address what had actually caused it. The same avoidance instinct she recognized uncomfortably from her 2 prior relationships, the ones that had ended not in dramatic explosions, but in slow, silent erosion. Neither party bothered to stop. She didn't want that for this. She booked a flight to Nashville the same afternoon, telling no one, arriving at Sam's apartment unannounced with a cake box balanced awkwardly against her hip. Sam opened the door already half laughing, half exasperated, disaster weaving anxiously around her ankles at the unexpected visitor. "You flew here with a cake," she said, somewhere between disbelief and amusement. "It's not an apology cake," Claire clarified, stepping inside. "It's I'm bad at admitting I'm scared of disappointing you, so I built something instead of saying it out loud cake. The words are harder for me than fondant, apparently." Sam's exasperation softened visibly, replaced by something gentler. "I don't need cakes, Claire," Sam said, though she accepted the box anyway, setting it carefully on the counter. "I need you to actually tell me when something's wrong, instead of disappearing into work until the guilt builds up enough that you show up at my door with dessert. That's not sustainable either." It was a fair criticism, and Claire absorbed it without the defensiveness she'd brought to the phone call 2 days earlier, standing in Sam's kitchen with nothing between them now but honesty. "You're right," Claire said. "I do that. I disappear into work because it's the one place I know exactly how to fix things. And relationships don't work like recipes, no matter how badly I want them to." Sam reached for her hand across the counter, not quite forgiveness yet, but close enough to it. "I don't need you to be perfect at this," she said. "I need you to keep showing up to the hard parts, not just the parts where you can fix everything with sugar and butter." They talked for hours that night, longer and more honestly than they had in the entire relationship so far, about the actual unglamorous mechanics of loving someone across a distance. The missed calls that would keep happening, the exhaustion that would keep showing up uninvited, the work it would take from both of them to keep choosing each other on the days when choosing felt harder than drifting. Neither of them pretended the 2-city plan was easy. They simply agreed together that it was still worth doing, which felt different and sturdier than the optimism they'd started with 3 months earlier. Claire flew back to Chicago 2 days later with an empty cake box and a clearer understanding of what this relationship was actually going to require of her. Not the fairy tale version where love simply solved logistics, but the harder, truer version where 2 people kept choosing the inconvenient thing, because the alternative, losing each other, had become unthinkable somewhere in the last 3 months, quietly, the way the truest things always seem to arrive. A year almost to the day after Walter's stroke, Claire found herself back in the same hospital parking garage where Denise had first said Sam's name out loud, except this time she was there for a checkup that had gone well, Walter walking ahead of them with only a faint hitch in his step, complaining loudly about the validation machine the way he always had. Sam met them there, off shift, having traded a co-worker's morning rounds for the chance to be present for the appointment. And the 4 of them, Claire, Walter, Denise, Sam, stood together in a configuration that would have seemed impossible the year before. The 2-city arrangement had settled over the months into something neither of them had expected at the start. Not a compromise exactly, but a rhythm. Alternating weekends, a shared calendar color-coded between Nashville and Chicago, an assistant manager at the bakery, competent enough that Claire could finally trust the shop without checking in every 6 hours. Sam had been promoted, eventually, to a position with more flexibility, more say over her own schedule, which made the alternating weekends easier to coordinate, though neither of them pretended the distance had become effortless. It simply became theirs, the specific shape their love had learned to take. It was Walter, of all people, who brought up the elephant neither of them had addressed out loud in months, blunt as ever despite his continued recovery. "You 2 have been doing this dance for almost a year," he said, leaning on his cane in the parking garage, addressing them both with the directness only a man who'd nearly died twice could fully afford. cities, flights, calendars. When does someone actually ask the question instead of just living the answer for 12 months straight? Denise, beside him, made no effort to hide her agreement, arms crossed in the exact stance she'd used the day she first confronted Claire about Sam. Claire felt her face heat, glancing at Sam, who looked equally caught off guard by her father's bluntness, though something in her expression suggested she'd been thinking the same thing for longer than she'd admitted. "Dad," Claire started, but Walter waved her off with the particular stubbornness that had survived a stroke fully intact. "I'm not getting any younger," he said, "and I'd like to dance at something before I go, preferably something more interesting than a hospital corridor." Denise laughed despite herself, and even Sam's nervousness cracked into a reluctant smile. It wasn't, in the end, Walter's bluntness that prompted the actual conversation, but something smaller and quieter. Later that same evening, when Claire and Sam found themselves back in the same parking garage alone, Walter and Denise having gone ahead to get the car. The garage was nearly empty, lit by the particular sodium orange glow that made everything look softer than it was, and Sam, fidgeting with her car keys in a way entirely unlike her usual composure, finally said the thing she'd apparently been working up to all day. "Posso te ligar depois do hospital?" she asked, the Portuguese clumsy and careful in her mouth, the phrase Claire had taught her months earlier as a joke during one of their video calls. A small private language built from Claire's first language and Sam's stubborn determination to learn pieces of it for her. Claire blinked, caught entirely off guard by the question landing in a language Sam barely spoke, in the exact parking garage where this had all somehow started. "You already have my number," Claire said slowly, suspicious now that something larger was happening beneath the surface of the question. Sam exhaled, abandoning the rehearsed line entirely, and reached into her jacket pocket instead, pulling out a small box that made Claire's whole chest go tight and warm at once. "I've been asking some version of that question since the night I gave you a granola bar," Sam said, her composure finally cracking into something raw and unguarded. The version of her Claire had only ever seen in the courtyard at midnight. "Can I call you? Can I see you? Can I keep showing up every time for the rest of however many years we get? I'm asking the real version of it now." Claire's answer arrived before she'd even consciously decided to give it, the kind of answer that had been building, quietly, in careful layers, for an entire year of granola bars and parking garages and color-coded calendars, and a cake delivered with nothing but honesty inside the box instead of an apology. She said yes before Sam had finished the question properly, and Sam laughed, surprised and delighted, sliding the ring onto Claire's finger with hands that, for the first time since Claire had met her, weren't entirely steady. Denise and Walter, returning with the car a few minutes later, found them exactly there, in the same unglamorous parking garage where suspicion had first turned into recognition a year earlier. Claire crying the good kind of tears this time, Sam grinning in a way that made her look 10 years younger. Walter, surveying the scene from his cane, simply nodded once, satisfied, and said, "About time," which was, by his standards, the equivalent of a full wedding toast, and Denise for once didn't argue with him. Months later, at a small wedding in a garden outside Nashville, the cake stood 4 tiers tall, sugared lavender on every layer, built by Claire's own hands the night before, because some things, she'd decided, were worth doing herself even on the happiest day of her life. Sam wore green again, the same shade from their first real date, and when she finally said the actual vows, her voice barely wavered at all, steady the way it had been steady through every code call and hard conversation and quiet parking garage confession that had built them, slowly, into exactly this. 2 women who had learned, the hard and careful way, that the truest things rarely arrive quickly and are almost always worth the wait that built them.